Chapter 6 Crown of Thorns. Or that I could forget what I have been, or not remember what I must be now. Shakespeare. Richard II. 3.3 139 to 140. As the dogs of war were unleashed in Europe, the West became increasingly concerned about Iran. Hitler had his eye on the land of the Aryans. In the words of the American ambassador to Tehran at the time, Reza Shah began to feel like a helpless pawn upon the slippery chessboard of power politics. And anything that changed Reza Shah's fate affected the political fortunes of the Crown Prince. For both the Nazis and the Allies, Iran held the key to wartime victory. Long before hostilities actually reached Iran, both camps launched a new charm offensive to endear themselves to Reza Shah. Germany began ingratiating itself with Reza Shah by offering him, amongst other things, the steel mill he obsessively coveted. In 1936, the Hitler cabinet decreed that Iranians were exempted from the restrictions of the Nuremberg racial laws as pure-blooded Aryans. This cynical propaganda ploy in 1936 became in 1941 a helpful tool for the government of Reza Shah and his son Mohammad Reza Shah to save Iranian Jews from the murderous Nazi machine. When the final solution began to turn the anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws into a license for genocide, Iran used, amongst other things, the 1936 decree to save Iranian Jews from the ovens of Auschwitz. Thousands of European Jews who received Persian passports were also saved. It was in conjunction with this appeasing law that Reza Shah decided to change the way the countries of the West refer to Iran. For over 2,500 years, those who have lived in Iran have called themselves Irani or Iranian. But when Greeks and Iranians were entangled in a long bloody war more than 2,000 years ago, the Greek historian Herodotus chose to call the foes not Irani but Persians, after Pers or Pars, a province of Iran where Persepolis, the imposing capital of the Iranian Empire, was located at the time. From that time on, Westerners continued to use Persian to refer to Iranians, and by the early 20th century, the name conjured everything the Romantics loved about the country, from the poetry of Omar Khayyam and the beauty of Persian carpets to the delicacies of caviar and the beauty of the Persian feline. Nevertheless, Reza Shah chose to forfeit the name Persia for Iran, evoking not the grandeur of the Persian past, but consanguinity with the Aryan myth. It had obviously not reached Reza Shah that the Nazi concept of Aryan had little to do with the historic race of Aryans who lived on the Persian plateau. While the British and American governments worried about these apparently pro-Nazi gestures, as well as other signs of increased German influence in Iran, they also began mending fences with Reza Shah. When the Pahlavi court announced the engagement of the Crown Prince to his Egyptian bride, the U.S. ambassador in Iran wrote a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt suggesting that, in view of the state of our relations with Iran, I believe that the absence of a message from you will create an unfavorable impression in Tehran. Inasmuch as it is understood that the relations between the Shah and the Crown Prince are particularly close, I believe that the Shah would be especially appreciative of a message on this occasion. Several heads of state, including the President of Poland and the Emperor of Japan, had earlier sent such notes of congratulations on April 19, 1939. The King and Queen of England had sent the Princes of Albania and the Earl of Athlone as their personal representatives to the wedding. Franklin Roosevelt not only sent the suggested note, but followed it with another letter, this time congratulating Reza Shah for the important and far-reaching reforms that have been introduced in Iran under Your Majesty's inspiration and guidance, and in particular for the completion of the Trans-Iranian Railway. The warmth of the two notes was particularly striking in light of the fact that only a couple of years earlier, Reza Shah had suspended Iran's diplomatic ties to the United States over a minor incident in Washington. The British were concerned not only about Nazi Germany and its plans for Iran, but also about Soviet designs on the entire region. They anticipated that the inevitable Soviet expansion would in the first instance be directed against Iran and Afghanistan. These anxieties only increased when Stalin and Hitler signed their infamous 1939 Non-Aggression Pact. After the surprising agreement, the Soviet and German legations began to work in close collaborations in Iran. In November 1939, a coup attempt masterminded by the Soviets was discovered in Tehran, and according to Soviet archives, 300 officers were arrested. Toward the end of the same year, the British Embassy in Tehran learned that 7 to 12 officers of the Iranian army had been arrested and accused of espionage on behalf of the USSR. In late 1939, Russia coerced Iran into a new commercial agreement that forced Iran to use exclusively Russian oil in the north of the country and to guarantee Germany transit rights through Iran. Some 300 new alleged German commercial travelers came to Iran through the Soviet Union. In this period, the Germans went so far as to promise Iran that, should they win the war, they would return Bahrain, the oil-rich island in the Persian Gulf claimed by Iran at the time and for the next quarter of a century as one of its provinces and controlled by Britain, to Iranian control. In May 1941, the British Embassy in Iran began developing strategies that it would implement in the case of a German or Russian occupation of northern Iran. In August 1941, the British Embassy reported that Germans had been planning a coup in Iran. Nazis had also found willing allies in leaders of the Qashqai tribes, who not only helped hide two of Nazi Germany's spy masters, Berthold Schultz Holthus and Franz Mayer, in their midst, but declared themselves ready to help a massive uprising in favor of Germany. Another reliable source told the British Embassy about a planned attempt on the life of Reza Shah and the declaration of a republic in August 1941. Documents from Nazi archives confirm some of these reports and show in detail the German government's effort to bring about a coup to end the Pahlavi era. One of the Pahlavi dynasty's nemesis, Ahmad Qavam, was an accomplice and the designated leader of one such failed coup attempt. Other sources suggest General Iram as the coup leader. As a countermeasure to these Nazi and Soviet conspiracies, the British government began to develop two contingency plans. They took steps to create a network of organizations capable of operating in territory threatened with invasion. Their job would be to stiffen the resistance of the national forces and population against Soviet encroachment. According to the British and American embassies, during this period the Nazis too were busy trying to build a pro-Nazi militia network. It was believed that the German embassy could, through its secret network, place 500 tough and well-armed men in the streets of Tehran within a few hours. The second contingency plan called for the occupation of the oil-rich southern regions of Iran. From the time oil was discovered in Khuzestan and the British landed, a contract affording them monopoly rights over it, they had considered Iran's southern regions as their sphere of interest. They were interested in the rest of the country only to the extent that it allowed them to keep control of the oil fields. More than once, including the days when Reza Khan organized his coup in 1921, they had entertained plans to simply separate the oil-rich province of Khuzestan from Iran altogether if that was the only way they could keep their hands on the oil fields. Reza Shah took false comfort in the belief that Iran's often declared neutrality would suffice to keep him and the country safe from the engulfing flames of the coming war. He might have been banking on a Nazi victory in the war. He was more interested in training his crown prince to assume power, and preparing the army and the nation to take orders from a new king. In fact, in his memoirs, the Shah claims that a few years before the advent of the war, his father had even contemplated resigning from the throne to stay around as an elder statesman and avail me of his advice. It is impossible to confirm this claim. Even for the Shah, the story was nothing but heresy. As the Shah himself admits, his father never discussed the resignation idea even with him. Only long after Reza Shah's death did a close aide reveal the alleged plan to the Shah. There is, however, no doubt that from 1939 Reza Shah was beginning to groom his crown prince more actively for his future responsibilities. He took the crown prince to more official functions and inspections and ordered every new ambassador to Tehran to call on the crown prince after they had presented their credentials to Reza Shah, as diplomatic protocol required. Reza Shah also began to use his crown prince as an interpreter in some of the most sensitive negotiations with foreign officials. On June 17, 1939, when Lord Cadman, the storied British oilman, met with Reza Shah, H.I.M., the Crown Prince, was also present and acted as interpreter. The conversations were reportedly useful, and as a result, it is openly stated in the capital that the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company would pay £2 million as advance on royalties or as a gift to the Shah. Amongst those making courtesy calls on the Crown Prince was Sir Reeder Bullard, the British ambassador, who made just such a visit in January 1940. He found the manner of the prince more engaging than that of Reza Shah, but the cynical gloom of the father had become in the son a pessimistic petulance, which he does not attempt to restrain. According to the same report, the Crown Prince took a keen interest in public affairs and followed events in Europe rather carefully. He considered the war a nuisance and thought it could have been prevented. He criticized Western strategies on both the diplomatic and military planes. It was, he believed, a great pity that Germany had been driven into the arms of Russia. And foreshadowing his future love of military matters and his tendency to think himself a great military strategist, he even offered strong opinions about the conduct of the war and the military decisions of generals. Bullard reported this part of his conversation with the equivalent of a smirk on his prose. By then, he had developed his prosaic smirk into an art. Another sign of the changing times came on October 27, 1940. The Crown Prince's 21st birthday was celebrated throughout the country with greater than usual fanfare. In the morning, there was a ceremony at the court where government officials and commanding officers of the armed forces offered their congratulations and paid allegiance to the future king. As in previous years, the centerpiece of the celebration had been a grand exhibit by Iran's Boy Scouts. Participation in parliamentary exercise had become part of the curriculum for every school in the country, and the Boy Scouts were one of the ways of inculcating Spartan ways and values in the impressionable minds of the youth. Boys often practiced up to 6 weeks preparing for the Crown Prince's birthday celebration, rehearsing their march and other feats of wondrous discipline and coordination. That year, the Crown Prince attended the event with a special guest. His name was Baldur von Schirach, the storied leader of Hitler's infamous youth movement, the Hitlerjugend. Von Schirach participated in the celebrations standing next to the Crown Prince. He later became a poster boy for Nazi propaganda and an infamous convict at the Nuremberg trials. Part of that year's program called for the Boy Scouts to exhibit their dexterity and prowess in putting out a fire. The script called for them to set up tents in a makeshift camp, and then, when one of the tents caught fire, the scouts would work in tandem, quickly creating a quake and passing buckets of water to put it out. But instead of controlled fire, as the script stipulated, the tent was suddenly engulfed in flames. Instead of a choreographed show of discipline and creativity, hundreds of frightened boys, forgetting any semblance of order, panicked and fled the scene in utter chaos, embarrassing the grown-ups. In retrospect, the Boy Scout spectacle, the failure of the... No, I'm going to read that again. That sounded ridiculous. Instead of the choreographed show of discipline and creativity, hundreds of frightened boys, forgetting any semblance of order, panicked and fled the scene in utter chaos, embarrassing the grown-ups. In retrospect, the Boy Scout spectacle, the failure of the organizers to practice even once with an actual fire, and the poor planning in setting a tent on fire all foreshadowed what would be the surprisingly quick collapse of the Iranian military. In spite of the joyous mood of official celebrations in 1940, the annual political report prepared by the British Embassy of Tehran for that year offers a grim image of realities in Iran. The 1940 report describes Reza Shah as the mainspring of all activities in the country. He appeared to many in the diplomatic corps, more greedy, more arrogant, and more unpopular than before. By 1940, there was a palpable perception amongst the populace that every mailbox in the country was under police surveillance, and that anyone seen putting a suspicious envelope, particularly one critical of the king, into a mailbox would be arrested. Reza Shah did not even see foreign diplomats except at formal visits. The British ambassador, for example, had not met Reza Shah in private for more than 3 years. Reports from the American embassy in Iran confirm that the same was true about other ambassadors. There is ample evidence that ministers habitually give the Shah hasty and optimistic reports. A shortage of bread causing long lines had created new waves of public resentment. Nobody in the royal family, according to the British embassy, including the Crown Prince, enjoyed the support and goodwill of the people. Reza Shah, according to the annual report, continued to be morbidly sensitive to any reference in the foreign press that is not adulatory, and thus, within a year, this led to diplomatic rows with the American, Swedish, and Swiss legations. In 1939, Iran broke diplomatic ties with France over a magazine's use two homophonic words, the Persian word Shah and the French chat, meaning cat, for a comical pun. 2 years later, another article in the French press led to another suspension of diplomatic ties. The Crown Prince was intimately involved in the way Iran responded to what is considered the insulting pun, telling his father of a new law in France prohibiting attacks on heads of state. In fact, in the heat of negotiations between Iran and France over this controversy, the Iranian ministers of foreign affairs and culture met directly with the Crown Prince instead of with Reza Shah, and took orders from him about how to proceed. The experience seemed to have had a formative influence on the Crown Prince all his life. He too remained obsessively sensitive to every imagined slight in the Western media, and he invariably saw an elaborate conspiracy behind each such criticism. The annual report went on to say that Reza Shah entertains for economic development a feverish passion, which in many cases is heightened by a personal and financial interest. In spite of the economic gains in the country, according to the British Embassy, dissatisfaction was widespread, and the government's only remedy is a vigilant police, a controlled press, and now a controlled wireless broadcast service. Tehran radio was opened in April. The Crown Prince took part in the official launch of the studio. Fear of public incitements to riots and regicide were great enough that the Iranian press remained silent on the subject of the failed attempt on the life of King Farouk, the Crown Prince's brother-in-law, and even on the Munich assassination attempt against Hitler. The accumulated result of the discontent and political dysfunction was the British Embassy's conclusion that there is little chance that the Pahlavi dynasty will maintain itself. What makes this prediction less an indication of British prescience, but more a rancor between them and Reza Shah, is the fact that the British had made the same dire predictions as early as 1926. In October of that year, for example, the British charge in Tehran wrote that, "I do not think there are too many intelligent men in Persia who imagine that Reza Shah can for long maintain his throne. For the royal family, maybe the only good news of that year came on October 27 when the Crown Prince and his wife, Princess Fawzia, had their first child, a girl named Shanaz. While Reza Shah was preoccupied with domestic developments, the European war inched closer to Iran every day. He made every effort to maintain an air of normalcy in the country, but try as he might, the European war was never as remote as he liked to pretend. Even his attempt to assuage British anxieties by appointing in July 1941 the notoriously Anglophile Ali Mansour as Prime Minister and dismissing the no less Germanophile Prime Minister Ahmed Matan Daftari was of no avail. Only 4 days after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, Britain and the Soviet Union delivered a threatening note to Iran about what they perceived was the danger of Nazi presence in the country. In the note, they claimed that there were more than 5,000 German nationals in Iran. In the parlance of World War II, such a large population was the perfect embryo for a Nazi fifth column. By then, Hitler had reneged on his 1939 non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, a disingenuous pact both sides signed only by themselves, time for what they knew was the inevitable war between them. When the pact was broken, the Soviet Union and Britain became allies and worried about the German presence in Iran, a presence made even more dangerous by the fact that many Germans worked in the Iranian state-run railroad system. By then, it was clear that this railroad was a key to supplying the badly beleaguered Soviet army. The rapidly advancing Nazi forces inside the Soviet Union were moving towards the oil fields of Baku, and thus the Iranian border. The fact that 8 Axis ships were also anchored off the Iranian port of Bandar Shapur made the Russo-British fears about the German threat more plausible. In retrospect, however, it seems clear that for the Allies, talk of the German fifth column was as much a tactical tool of propaganda as it was a genuine military concern. While the American embassy in Tehran put the number of German nationals in Iran at about 2,500, about half the figure claimed by the British, even the British embassy in Iran considered its own government's claims exaggerated. As late as July 1941, Sir Reeder Bullard had indicated that, in his view, the number of Germans in Iran is not more than 2,000, including dependents. When the ambassador finally wrote a memo for the Foreign Office indicating his brief about the exaggerated nature of the British government's claim, Winston Churchill was angry enough to write a terse note to the Foreign Secretary himself, saying, "Your minister in Tehran does not seem to be at all at the level of events. I feel this business requires your personal grip." Churchill had declared earlier that we mean to get the Germans in Iran in our hands if we have to come to Tehran and invite the Russians there too. Undoubtedly, we must acquire complete military control of Persia during the war. Reza Shah all but ignored these increasingly threatening notes and other hints of British and Soviet anxiety. Clearly, the Crown Prince, who accompanied his father constantly in those days, made no effort to change Reza Shah's views. Father and son both believed and reiterated often to foreign or domestic visitors that Iran, and only Iran, could decide which foreigners worked in the country. While spending his days with his father, the Crown Prince's nights were spent at court with a small group of friends, nearly all foreign-trained technocrats or married to a foreigner, gambling, playing parlor games, or watching movies. One night early in 1941, when he and his friends were enjoying a few drinks and playing a card game, Reza Shah suddenly walked in. He had never come to any of these events unannounced, and his appearance shocked everyone into silence. The Crown Prince was a serious smoker in those days and had a cigarette in his hand. He too got up, standing at military attention, and lest his father see him smoking, he hid the cigarette in his hand behind his back. Reza Shah had come to inquire about progress on the building project. The visit to the Crown Prince's relief lasted only a few minutes, while Reza Shah's nocturnal visit showed his desire to attend to all affairs of state. He nevertheless ignored threatening notes from Britain and the Soviet Union. Was his failure to take them seriously the result of his arrogance, his ignorance of international realities, his calculation, or even the hope that Hitler's early victories on the Eastern Front would translate into Axis victory in the war? Some have argued that the Anglophile politicians, particularly Ali Mansour, Iran's prime minister at the time, intentionally kept Reza Shah in the dark about the seriousness of the threats. Theirs, it is claimed, was a premeditated act of treason intended to pave the way for the British invasion of Iran. After the British ambassador met with Reza Shah to deliver the first serious note of that threat, he came away convinced that Reza Shah had been kept badly informed by his ministers as to the state of negotiations. When reminiscing about his life while he was in exile, Reza Shah offered a different reason for his inaction. He told Feridun Jam, his favorite son-in-law, that in his view, Iran had no reason to help the Allies, and besides, the war did not indicate who would emerge as the victor. The Shah, on the other hand, suggests that the cabinet did not tell his father the truth because they were too afraid to tell him that the Allies were intent on forcefully carrying out their threats. Even after 20 years, when the Shah looked at the letters exchanged between Iran and the Allies, he still categorically rejected the idea that the Germans' presence presented any threat to the Allies. Furthermore, Mohammad Reza Shah rejected the claim that his father harbored Nazi sympathies. With surprising candor and naivety, he declared, because my father had himself dictatorial tendencies, he could not have tolerated another dictator like Hitler. After the receipt of the initial note of protest from the Anglo-Soviet Allies in 1941, the Iranian government had initially declared in a defiant tone of wounded nationalist pride that the work of Germans in Iran was a matter concerning the sovereign Iranian government and no one else. 2 days after the receipt of the initial threat, Reza Shah gave one of his characteristically short speeches, this one to a class of graduating officers. And though he made no direct reference to the threat, he declared that all leaves of absence for officers had been cancelled. He ended by suggesting that the army and its officers must take an active interest in the present situation, and if need be, must be prepared to sacrifice their lives. The next day, the semi-official daily paper, Itelaat, published an editorial calling on the people to action and sacrifice to save the nation's honor. In meeting with diplomats, Reza Shah insisted that the war was no business of his, and when a cash-strapped British government asked for a respite in the annual payment of oil revenues to Iran, increased substantially after a new round of negotiations in 1940, Reza Shah demurred, insisting instead on a guaranteed minimum of £4 million a year for 2 years and a payment down of arrears. Iran's urgent need to industrialize, Reza Shah told the British ambassador, was far more important than the war in distant Europe, After the meeting, Bullard poignantly captured his government's frustrations with Reza Shah when he wrote that Reza Shah has twisted the lion's tail often enough over the oil concessions to get the erroneous idea that our patience is almost unlimited. The angry notes Britain delivered to Iran on those August days signaled the end of the lion's patience.